Well, as MPs leave Parliament Hill behind for the summer, they return to ridings where families are trying to cope with soaring costs and serious affordability challenges, fueling a relentless climb in record-setting inflation driven by higher costs for gas, food, and by supply chain problems. Inflation hit 7.7% last month. The government claims its economic measures will help. Conservatives want cuts to the gas taxes and a suspension of the federal carbon tax. New Democrats have called for an increase for low-income families in the GST rebates and child tax benefits. But how much can governments do, and what should Canadians expect to see in the weeks ahead? Ian Lee is an associate professor at the Sprott School of Business at Carleton University. Professor Lee, thanks for joining me. It's good to see you again. Look, there's certainly the sticker shock each month as inflation hits another high, and that's not just a number. It represents serious hardship for many families. How much worse should we expect inflation to get, and for how long?
I actually think, Peter, that we're nearing the peak. And I say that because when you deconstruct or decompose the inflation rate, we know that the single largest driver is energy, and more precisely oil, and more precisely gasoline. Well, I don't think there's any serious forecaster predicting that oil is going to run up again yet more from 115 WTI per barrel to 140 or 150 or 180. So I think that the oil is pretty well at the upper level, which suggests that that's not going to continue to drive inflation going forward. And then secondly, I agree with Governor Macklem that the supply chain disruptions are going to come back into balance. They do take time. I will not use that word transitory because I don't know when. But the nature of supply and demand when you have shortages is that market forces will bring them back into balance over time. So I think by the end of this year, 2022, I'm not suggesting prices are going to drop through the floor, but I think it will have plateaued and maybe be declining a little bit.
Okay, what do you see as the role of the federal government in helping to dampen inflation, and how is this government fulfilling that role?
Of course, the government has a role. It has a twofold role, really. One's fiscal policy, of course, which is the Minister of Finance and government spending and all the things that government does through its myriad government departments. And then on the more structural medium term, of course, it has monetary policy and interest rates. So let me deal with the latter first, because I think that interest rates are much more effective, have a much bigger impact on the entire economy because they are such a blunt instrument. And Peter, I lived through the 70s. I was a young man in my 20s. I was a mortgage manager at the Bank of Montreal beside the National Press Club opposite the West Block of Parliament Hill. And I lent millions and millions of dollars in that period when inflation went from 4, then it went to 5, to 7, to 8, to 10. Eventually it peaked, I believe it was at 14, and they drove interest rates up to 20%. Now, we produced a horrible recession, the worst since the Great Depression, but it absolutely destroyed and eliminated inflation for the next 30, 35 years. I'm not advocating that. I'm not suggesting we're going down that road, but interest rates do work. They do suppress demand. They do kill inflation if you push them up high enough.
Okay, let me.
That's on the monetary side.
Okay, quickly on the government side.
Quickly on the government side, I think it's more, I don't want to call it cosmetic, but it's more temporary Band-Aid type relief. You can do targeted relief. You can do a gas tax suspension, as they've just done in the States for 3 months, 6 months, 9 months. Or you can target it, as the NDP is suggesting, to low, modest income people. But that's really it's a Band-Aid. And I mean by a Band-Aid, it's not dealing with the underlying structural drivers that's creating the inflation.
All right. So the essential role for the Bank of Canada is to try and get back to that inflation target rate of 2 or 3%, and it's pushing up borrowing rates quickly to try and get there. Some have suggested the bank could move more slowly to cushion the shock. What's your view?
I've been critical publicly, Peter, since April 2021. I was critical of both the Bank of Canada and the Government of Canada because when you looked at the data, and the data that Ms. Freeland, as the finance minister, was bragging about, properly so, in the 2021 budget. That's over a year ago, right? And she was saying, look, our economy's booming. It's up to 6% GDP. We've recovered all the jobs. And I kept saying in my comments to my own students, I was quoting Supertramp, that great line, that great song, crisis. What crisis? In other words, we had recovered from an economic point of view. I wasn't denying that people weren't getting COVID and people weren't getting sick. But from a GDP point of view, employment point of view, growth point of view, we were pandemic, and there was no longer a need for fiscal stimulus, which is what large deficits are, and the interest rates were far too low. And I was warning then that inflation, where they were going to let the inflation genie out of the bottle, as we did in the late 70s, and it's a lot harder to put it back in the bottle once it's out of the bottle.
Okay, very quickly, we've only got about 20 seconds left here. Do you believe we're headed for a recession?
I don't think so. It's not the 70s, notwithstanding I just said that. One huge difference. Back then, there were millions of young boomers, and many couldn't find jobs, very high unemployment. Today, we have the exact opposite situation, massive labor shortages. It's going to be a tough 12 to 18 months, but I don't think we're going to tip into a recession.
All right, Ian Lee, always good to get your perspective. Thanks again for providing it tonight. Take care.
My pleasure, Peter. Thank you.